Last week we heard about Jesus going over the lake in the boat and the great storm, and Jesus calms the storm. We did that as an aside. We focused on Job last week, and it's a good thing that we did focus on Job last week, because something in our story today correlates with what we said last week quite strongly. But we're back in the book of Mark in chapter 5. When Jesus had crossed again, so now Jesus crossed the sea and stilled the storm and got to the other side, and then there's that story about the man possessed by a legion of demons, who Jesus drives the demons out of into a herd of pigs, and they go off the cliff, and now he comes back over to the side from which he departed. And when he had crossed again, a great crowd gathered around him he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." We'll get to the color coding when we've gone through the text. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better. But rather, having grown worse, she had heard about Jesus, and having come up behind him in the crowd, she touched his cloak. For she said to herself, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you, and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Now, if you're like me, by the end of this part of the telling, you've almost forgotten about Jairus and his daughter, haven't you? But the story is not done. While he was still speaking, some people came from Jairus' house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother, and those who were with him, Peter, James, and John, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kume," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about, because she was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement, but he strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You might have experienced the loss of a child yourself. You might know people close to you have. Especially the sudden passing of a child. You might know the suffering of 12 years of sickness, of incurable sickness, not only that, but of stigmatized sickness. You might know that quite well for yourself. or it might be something that happens and has happened, it is happening to someone close to you. That is to say, when we discuss this story, the most important thing we must do is we must treat the people in the story as fully realized human beings. They're not props. They're not plot lines. They are fully incarnate, fully alive, feeling, breathing, suffering people, the way all of us are fully alive, breathing, living, and suffering. So what we'll do is we'll run through the text one more time. We'll focus on the pieces in color, and then we will say one or two words about faith, and then we will talk a bit about what all this means. So the first thing in reading the text that I think we need to point out is where Jairus, verse 23, speaks to Jesus, falls down on the ground and pleads that he will do something. He says, "Come lay your hands on her so that she may be made well." When the woman is coming up behind Jesus and she touches his clothes, she said to herself, I didn't highlight this part, my mistake, but this is verse 28. She said to herself, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." And then at the end, after she had told him everything, Jesus turns to her and says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." Now, if that word meant you had been healed, it would have said you have been healed. But the word there refers to being made well, which is something, I think, at least at a deep human level, is something completely different. So that's the first thing we need to point out. The other thing is, these words in blue, I suppose it's not blue. What kind of color is that? It's blue, it's blue enough, isn't it? Okay. This is for the people who like their languages, are all in the past sense, but now in Greek there's past tense, as in I fell off the stage, and then there's past tense, I have fallen off the stage, as there is in English, of course. And in the Greek, something incredible happens in this very long passage, from verse 25 to the end of 27. Look at the amount of hads and has-beens and has happened in this text compared to the one in red on the next page. This woman had been suffering. She had endured. She had spent all that she had. She had only grown worse. She had heard about Jesus. She had come up from behind in the crowd, and then suddenly the haves and the has and the haven'ts and the hasn't stop. And she touched his cloak. It's gone from an action that was completely and utterly handled in the past to an action that is actively happening there in that moment. After 12 years of having and had and having not, she touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." I think in a certain sense, I was going to call this sermon one for the has-beens, because I think in a certain sense we're all has-beens, not just in terms of age, but in terms of the fact that that we have been suffering, we have been living, we have been on the wrong side of life and of luck, each in our own separate way. And something in all these has-beens that happened to this woman, I think, speaks to our faith as well, because I think faith is in a certain sense that moment of moving from has-been to being. But we'll say a word more about that when we get there. A few different ways to talk about this passage. The first is, and I believe the best way, is to simply tell the story. Simply say we're confronted with such an incredible story. Mark is giving us a sandwich story. He starts with a little girl, then he interrupts himself with the story about the woman, and then he finishes with the little girl as well. So we can tell the story, and we certainly should tell the story, but we must talk about this thing called faith. Verse 34, He said to her after the woman had been healed, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." When he's talking to Jairus, this is verse 36, Jesus said, upon hearing that the girl was dead, Jesus says, "Do not fear, only believe," otherwise translated, only have faith. Now, I started by saying with the kids that God loves honesty, God loves truth. And truth is often strong medicine. So it's important to now get on the same page what we mean when we talk about faith. We could read this passage as if faith is some kind of superpower. And if you had enough faith, then no matter what happened to you in life, you could overcome it. It's the one option. And I'm not dismissing any options, I'm saying that's one. Faith is a superpower. Here's another. Faith is a last resort. Faith is that thing you turn to when you have exhausted all other options. So faith is simply reserved for those things that you can't solve on your own. So when you've tried everything in your power, then the last thing you do is you say to God, "Well, God, I've now tried everything in my power. This is my last resort. I'll give it to you." So faith can be interpreted as a superpower, or it can be interpreted as a last resort. Here's perhaps the most difficult one. We can also say, but faith is a command. Faith is an imperative. We can read this story and do a very irresponsible thing. We can say, well, all the woman needed was faith, and so that means all you need to solve your problems is faith as well. And you should believe like the woman. Well, we don't know what she believes. We don't know exactly what she believes in that moment. We only have a snapshot of her life in that moment of reaching out. So we could spend the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes talking about faith as a superpower, or we could spend it talking about faith as a last resort, a last-ditch effort to get everything on track, or we could spend it talking about some kind of universal command that God gives us. You know, God, who loves us so personally and intimately, somehow gave us all the same one-size-fits-all answer to all our problems. Just have faith. It was like a instant soup. Just add water and everything will be all right. But let's do the difficult thing. Let's talk about faith, first of all, as an acknowledgement of truth. Let's talk about faith as something you do when everything, or when you acknowledge that everything is out of control, and that you have absolutely no control over your own life, over your own health. Now, of course, you have control over your health. You can decide what you eat, and if you exercise, and how much water you drink. But if you have been sick for 12 years with an incurable illness, or if you have lost your daughter to illness, then everything is out of control. Then having people in church say to you, "Oh, well, all you need is faith," is somehow the wrong answer. Faith is first of all truth. Faith is first of all facing with honesty what you are going through. It is not a blind leap into the unknown. It is a serious and calculated look at where you are. That is where faith begins. This is why when the woman touches Jesus' cloak and he feels the power going out of him and he turns around in the crowd and he says, "Who touched me?" The disciples say, "Are you mad? They're all touching you." Have you seen a celebrity walk through a crowd? People reaching out their hands, falling over each other just to touch. That's the idea. They're saying, all of these people are touching you. What do you mean? But Jesus is adamant. He turns around. He looks for this person. He knows what he felt. She knows that he's looking for her. She falls down and she tells him the whole truth. And when she had told him the whole truth, he says to her, "Your faith has made you well." Martin Luther lived in the 16th century, which was, by all accounts, I've made a spelling mistake there. A difficult time to be alive, but it was especially difficult for him. He lived in a time in which the Black Plague, swept through Europe. Martin Luther lost many of his close friends and family in that plague. Slightly later, he and his wife lost their 14-year-old daughter as well. Martin Luther knew something about suffering. Martin Luther knew a lot about faith as well. Martin Luther had a way of explaining that faith is not something that is within your control. Faith is what happens when everything is out of control. And he will go on to say that you have very little control to begin with. Martin Luther had a different way of talking about faith, and I think this one perhaps helps us more than the truth element. Luther talked about faith as art. The German word he used is Kunst, craft. Luther would say there's an art to faith. There's a craft to faith. Faith is not something you have. Faith is something you develop, nurture, polish, express. The way that you nurture and polish and develop and express a craft or an art. Luther will say that your spiritual maturity is measured by the craft, the art of your faith. How you respond to difficulty, how you respond to bad news, how you respond to suffering and to death and all the others. Luther didn't advocate for a blind leap of faith, or for faith as a superpower, or for faith as a last resort, or for faith as some kind of command that you need to have. Luther, first of all, looked at faith as the ability to truthfully express your lived experience. Who you are, where you are, what you are going through, and ultimately what you need. That's where faith begins. And I get tired of hearing about people who have been hurt in churches when they go through periods of suffering, and the people in church tell them, "Oh, but your faith isn't strong enough. You need to stir your faith more. The reason you're sick is you don't have faith, or the reason you're not getting healed is you don't have faith." I'm tired of it. I think it's hurtful. I don't think it belongs in church. What if we change the way we talked about faith when people come to us with their suffering? What if people came to us with incurable diseases or the death of their children, and instead of saying to them, "Oh, well, there's something wrong with your faith," we said to them, "Let's think about what is happening and let's talk about how we can help us understand your expression of faith better in this moment. What are you feeling? Where is God for you now when everything has been taken away? What do you want from God in this moment? What is your if only prayer, the way the woman said, if only I can touch his clothes? What is that if only you want to give to God? If only I had a last day with my beloved. If only I had spent more time at home instead of at work. Faith is not about the miracles. It's about the truth that Jesus breaks into the world and shows his kingdom for people who are ultimately just as undeserving as you and I. There's nothing in the text to indicate to us that the synagogue leader or the woman had some kind of extraordinary superpower. They were people like you and I. They doubted themselves. At times, they probably hated themselves the way we doubt ourselves and sometimes hate ourselves. And yet, when confronted with truth, with honesty, Jesus says, your faith has made you well. To Jairus, when his daughter has died, he says, don't fear, believe. When they get to the house, he says to the people who are wailing inside, she's not dead, she's only sleeping. He's speaking a specific truth in that moment, a truth which Jesus understands and which he has the power to enact. We don't have that power or sometimes that ability to understand. He says she's only sleeping, the people laugh, he chases them out. He goes into the room, he puts his hands on this little girl. He says, get up, stand up. He makes her walk around, he says to her parents, give her something to eat, and then he says, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone what's happened here. Your faith isn't measured by what you tell people about God. Your faith is measured by the truth you hold and the truth that you speak, and how seriously you take that in your own life. I think there's one more. I think suffering makes you a theologian. Theologian is someone who studies the knowledge of God, who studies this whole idea that God is contained in the scriptures of the Bible and what that has meant for the church throughout 2,000 years. Luther was a fantastic theologian. He was an incredibly educated man for his time, and he wrote extensively. And most of what he written is still as relevant today as it was in the 16th century. But Luther said, thinking about his own life, it is not by reading or writing or speculation that one becomes a theologian. Rather, it is by living, dying, and being damned. And when he says being damned, I think he means being damned into a life of suffering here on earth, that one becomes a theologian. There is no minister or pastor who has the answer or the authority to question or challenge your faith. Because if you have suffered in your life, you are a theologian. If you have cried out, why God? Then you are a theologian. If you have asked each other and asked yourself and asked God why things are happening, what to change, how to address the pain and the hurt in life, then you are as much a theologian as Martin Luther and all the rest. With one important condition: let's do it in a faith that is rooted in truth. Let's stop lying to each other in church. Let's stop stirring our faith to see things happen. Let's start being honest with ourselves, with each other, and also with God. So, we're on time. Perhaps a difficult sermon. Now, something else Martin Luther was fond of saying when talking to ministers and preachers, he says, if by the end of your sermon people don't want to either chase you out or never come back, you haven't done your job. and we're certainly welcome to talk about that afterwards when we have morning tea. But sometimes the word uplifts us, and sometimes the word shakes us. And I've been quite shaken this week by the word, by the idea that this woman in the story, this girl in the story, are people like you and I. They're no different. And perhaps the faith Jesus speaks of is closer to all of us than we imagine, if we just had the courage to step into it.